The H1 Zoom handy recorder versus the H1n Zoom released in 2018. Which should you buy, and if you have the H1 already, should you upgrade? For those of you with short attention spans, here's the quick version. If you don't have either of these, just buy the H1n since they're similarly priced. The more interesting question is whether you should upgrade if you already have the H1 Zoom. And that answer, in most cases, is a no. Unless you're in serious need of overdubbing, adjustable playback speeds, and a limiter, these two recorders in terms of specs are pretty much the same. However, if you're thinking you want to buy this for the limiter, you might want to stick around for the details. Otherwise, that's the verdict. If you're still around, let's dive into some details. I've had the H1 Zoom handy recorder for about 7 years now, and I recently got the H1n because of the onboard limiter. What I ended up finding out instead is that using a digital limiter is not very ideal because it adds a fair amount of background noise and hissing. It was so apparent while listening on my Audio Technicas that I decided this was indeed not worth the upgrade. It's much better to keep the peaks of your recording closer to -18 decibels and increase the gain in post than it is to turn on the limiter while having the input gain at a level that could potentially cause clipping. Here's an example of me clipping while using the limiter and then normalizing both to -3 decibels. Here's another example of me clipping on the H1 and then editing it in post by just adjusting levels to make it sound better. Here's an example of me clipping while using the limiter and then normalizing both to -3 decibels. Here's another example of me clipping on the H1 and then editing it in post by just adjusting levels to make it sound better. So the H1n limits it at -6 decibels, so anything you record that registers higher than -6 decibels will sound like that extremely muffled sound which you can tell has been compressed to death. The H1 on the other hand didn't sound that great either, but it was easy enough to edit to make it sound pretty much as good as the limiter on the H1n, if not better. But honestly, we want to avoid the possibility of clipping in the first place. Not to mention, I personally wouldn't use the built-in mics on these recorders to record voiceovers or dialogue in the first place, unless it was a sort of interview type situation where you don't have time to set anything up. I'll talk more on that in a video that specifically shows you guys the ways you can use your H1n or H1 Zoom recorder. I most likely won't be keeping the H1n, so it'll most likely be a tutorial about the H1 Zoom. For this video, I'll just do a quick comparison on the sound quality between the 7-year-old H1 and this brand new H1n. I've actually been recording this voiceover on the two mics for the sake of this video. I've been switching between the two, but I think it's best to hear the same exact thing be said twice in a row to compare it. I've actually been recording this voiceover on the two mics for the sake of this video. I've been switching between the two, but I think it's best to hear the same exact thing be said twice in a row to compare it. So did you hear any differences? Because I did a blind test on myself and there was absolutely no difference I could hear when listening to it on my laptop. That's why I busted out my trusty Audio Technicas, but all was in vain. There was still no difference whatsoever. Maybe if your ears are sensitive enough, you might be able to hear a slight difference, but there's actually not meant to be a difference since both mics have the same input mics. I'll also use two power device lav mics so that you guys can compare how it sounds while I use the recorders for applications that are more likely to happen. Usually this would be used in an interview situation, so I'll ask you guys a question. So, you've watched this video up until now. Did you find the video helpful? Well, I can't exactly hear you, but if you did find it helpful, why not hit that like button and consider subscribing? Usually this would be used in an interview situation, so I'll ask you guys a question. So, you've watched this video up until now. Did you find the video helpful? Well, I can't exactly hear you, but if you did find it helpful, why not hit that like button and consider subscribing? Did you hear a difference? Because I certainly didn't. Next, let's compare the build of the two recorders. For the most part, they're very similar, but one thing I don't really like about the H1n is that I feel like the battery cover just seems really loose. The H1's battery cover is solid and feels sturdy. It also helps that the H1's batteries are AA and just requires one battery versus the H1n, which needs two AAA batteries. According to Zoom's website, both of them have about a 10-hour recording time before you need to replace the batteries. In terms of material, they do feel a little different, and I personally do like the material of the H1 better. It just feels like it's higher quality to me. But in terms of button positions, knobs, and changing options in the device, the H1n wins hands down. The knob makes it so that you can adjust the gain without making clicking noises like you would in the H1. The options to change the recording format is displayed all on the screen, which is much more intuitive for beginners, where in the H1, you have to look in the back to change it every time. Not a huge difference, but I still prefer the H1n in that arena. Also, something to note is that there's an extra guard for the front and back of the XY built-in mics. This can potentially help prevent damage in case you drop your mic a certain way in certain situations. Overall, like I said before, I don't plan on keeping the H1n. The extra functions and changes to it still can't justify me spending the money to replace my 7-year-old H1. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions and what you think about these two recorders, or if there's a different recorder you much prefer. Just remember that in the end, it's more about your ability to create good content than it is which microphone you use. Best of luck to you guys out there. See you guys in the next one.